Well, then today is the second Sunday after Epiphany. We'll be here again in Hartford. The epistle for this second Sunday after Epiphany is taken from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 12. Brethren, having different gifts according to the grace that is given us, either prophecy to be used according to the rule of faith, or ministry and ministering, or he that teacheth in doctrine, he that exhorteth in exhorting, he that giveth with simplicity, he that ruleth with carefulness, he that showeth mercy with cheerfulness. Let love be without dissimulation, hating that which is evil, cleaving to that which is good, loving one another with the charity of the brotherhood, with honor preventing one another, in carefulness not slothful, in spirit fervent, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, instant in prayer, communicating to the necessities of the saints, pursuing hospitality. Bless them that persecute you, bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that rejoice, weep with them that weep. Being of one mind, one towards another, not mindful of high things, but consenting to the humble. That's what. And then the gospel. Taking that according to St. John, chapter 2. At that time, there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And Jesus also was invited, and his disciples, to the marriage. And the wine failing, the mother of Jesus saith to him, They have no wine. And Jesus said to her, Woman, what is that to me and to thee? My hour is not yet come. His mother saith to the waiters, Whatsoever he shall say to you, do ye. Now there were set there 6 water pots of a stone, according to the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 measures apiece. Jesus saith to them, Fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And Jesus said to him, Draw out now and carry to the chief steward of the feast. And they carried it. And when the chief steward had tasted the water made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the waiters knew who had drawn the water, the chief steward calleth and the bridegroom, and saith to him, Every man at first setteth forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, them that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. This beginning of the miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That's what the words of today's Holy Gospel. Heavenly Father, and Son of the Ghost, amen. So today, this second Sunday of Epiphany, after Epiphany, the time of the marriage feast of Cana, and the miracle of our Lord, doing his miracle in front of the disciples, and that there are some miracles that are seen by the disciples, some miracles are seen by the outside world. So there are many miracles seen only by the disciples, and he did this first miracle in the presence of his disciples, and also the miracle was seen by the servants, but not by the chief steward. The miracle was seen by the disciples and not by all the guests. And the miracle was commanded by the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so that there are various phases or levels of the understanding and the workings of our Lord Jesus Christ. There are some things that God shows to those that are on the outside in order to bring them in. But when they come into the church, then there are other things that He shows them once they arrive inside the church. Remember, our Lord. And then when we get to the kingdom of heaven, He will show yet other things. So that when we arrive at the kingdom of heaven, there will be other treasures shown to us that eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, neither entered into the heart of man. But today, just a brief consideration, not so much on the epistle and the gospel of today, but rather kind of a little catechism on our situation and which masses, what is the rule, what's the rule of the church on what masses we should attend or not attend, and the rule of the Mass on Sunday, the rule of going to the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and which Masses to attend, which Masses to not attend. What are some rules and principles to follow? It's a little catechism. We, of course, know by the third commandment that keep holy the Lord's Day, and this is a commandment of God. And St. Thomas Aquinas points out concerning the commandments that there are 10 commandments, and that all the commandments have negative and positive obligations. But 8 of the commandments, the principal obligation of the commandment is negative. Thou shalt not, I'm the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness, and so on. 8 of the commandments, the first statement is negative. This, says St. Thomas, is because the principal obligations of those 8 commandments have no exceptions. So there are also positive obligations of the first commandment, such as to pray. But we're not obliged to pray at every single instant of our lives. So there are exceptions to the positive obligation to pray, which is the positive obligation of the first commandment. The negative obligation, I'm Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me, has no exceptions. So if a man puts a gun to your head and says you must spit on a crucifix, or you must mock the true religion, or you must worship or burn incense to an idol, then we are obliged under pain of mortal sin to say no. And if we say yes to the persecutor, we commit a mortal sin. Remember, with regard to the martyr, the would-be martyr, he has 2 choices. Either to become a martyr and a saint, or to commit mortal sin and be damned. There is not a third option. Some souls believe, well, in those extreme circumstances, the saints will not burn incense before the idols. The average man will burn incense but not really mean it. And the wicked man will burn incense and mean it. This is false. The fact is that if you are told to burn incense to an idol, if you are told to spit on a crucifix, you are told to violate the first commandment by a worship of a false god or the rejection of the true God. There are no exceptions to this principal obligation. Thou shalt not have false gods. Thou shalt not have false gods before me. Then there are the 2 commandments that are positive. This is the third commandment and the fourth commandment. The third commandment is remember to keep holy the Lord's Day. And the fourth commandment, honor thy father and mother. These commandments are stated positively, says St. Thomas Aquinas, because the principal obligations have exceptions. So the principal obligation of the third commandment is to do something holy in honor of God on the day of the Sabbath. So on the day of the Sabbath, the principal obligation is to do something holy. So in the Old Testament, you would say prayers and do the worship and keep the Sabbath day holy. In the New Testament, this means primarily the attendance of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And then if it's impossible to attend Mass, then there will be the fulfillment of something to make the day holy, like a holy hour, or at least a half hour. Minimum would be like 30 minutes set aside for God, so that even if you cannot go to Mass on Sunday, you're still obliged to keep the day holy. So you still must do something to keep the day holy, even if you cannot go to Mass. However, there are exceptions. Supposing that you are in the trenches in a war, and you're on a 24-hour watch, and you're guarding the machine gun, and you're shooting at the bad guys. You are doing that on your 24-hour watch between midnight on Sunday until midnight on Monday. And all you have to do is keep shooting. Well, you just keep shooting. You're not able to take your half hour of prayer time. You're not able to go to Mass, which the other soldiers are going to Mass in the back of a Jeep somewhere on the other side of the battlefield. But you're not able to do that. The positive obligation has exceptions. Example given, of course, in the Old Testament is the example of Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus, when it knew that the Sabbath day was holy, were not allowed to work or fight on the Sabbath day. And so on one particular Sabbath day, the enemies of God, the soldiers of Tryphon, or the soldiers of Antiochus Epiphanes, attacked the Jews and slaughtered them. They refused to fight. And so they were wiped out. And then the enemies of God figured out, they don't fight on Sabbath. We'll just wait till next Saturday, attack them again. So they just took vacation during the week. And then during that week, the Judas discussed with the other soldiers that we're not going to attack the enemy on the Sabbath. But if they attack us the next Sabbath, which they're going to probably do, we will fight back. And so they talk to the high priest, they talk to the priest, and well, we're not supposed to fight on the Sabbath, but this is a secondary obligation, not a primary obligation. And hence, there are exceptions to it. The next Sabbath came, and the enemies of God attacked the Jews, and this time the Jews wiped them out. Then Tryphon figured they would go to plan B, we'll have another battle plan. Well, they've wiped them out. So with regard to the third commandment, to keep holy the Lord's Day, there are exceptions to the principal obligations. The same is true of the fourth commandment. In the fourth commandment, honor thy father and mother, our principal obligation is obedience. But there are exceptions to obedience. And here we're not talking about sinful obedience. Because if you're commanded to murder someone, if you're commanded to do something evil, you're obliged to say no. But there are in fact legitimate commands given by a father which must be disobeyed sometimes, which must not be followed sometimes. So the father tells you, for instance, you must take out the trash, and you must take it out to the street, and you must put it inside the dumpster. But it turns out that Al-Qaeda is outside, and it turns out that the Unabomber delivered a package, and it's inside of the trash can, and it turns out there's an airstrike on your trash can. Now, those being the cases, Daddy didn't know about those three things, and so he said, take out the trash. You can say, no, I'm not going to take out the trash. And there's an exception to that obligation. It was not a sinful command. It was a legitimate command. You would normally fulfill the command, but there are circumstances which say, no, I'm not going to fulfill it in this situation. So when we talk about sinful obedience, this does not apply. There obviously sinful obedience can never be done. So we're talking about a legitimate command, and then you don't fulfill it because of circumstances that arise that make you not fulfill it. And this is the case of all laws, all positive laws. We have the expression, lex positiva non obligat in grave incommodo. Now the fourth and third commandment come together, which means positive laws don't oblige in grave inconvenience. They come together with regard to the Sunday obligation, because we're obliged by the divine law to keep the day holy, which means do something to make the day holy. Say a rosary, do a holy hour, do something supernatural. Then we have a positive law of the church, which is like the Father commanding us. How do you keep the Sunday holy? You keep it holy by going to Mass. And you must go to Mass specifically, because it's a law of the church, between the offertory prayer, the Dominus Vobiscum and the Dominus Vobiscum. So after the sermon, so you can leave during the sermon. If you don't like the sermon, you leave during the sermon. You come back after the sermon, and you need to be there before Dominus Vobiscum until Dominus Vobiscum. That's the rule. Dominus Vobiscum. You notice after the Credo, there's a Dominus Vobiscum. The next Dominus Vobiscum is going to be after the communion antiphon, not the receiving of Holy Communion, but the communion antiphon. And if you are missing between Dominus Vobiscum and Dominus Vobiscum, you have not fulfilled your Sunday obligation. Unless, of course, there is a grave reason. And this law was very well known before Vatican II. Father Hannafin used to tell me that the men would always stand outside the church, and they would wait until that credo was finished, and they would come pouring in at Dominus Vobiscum. And once the second Dominus Vobiscum happened, they were gone before Et meas est. So they knew that it had to be from Dominus Vobiscum to Dominus Vobiscum. They were there from Dominus Vobiscum to Dominus Vobiscum, and not 1 second before and not 1 second after. In the holy days before Vatican II, when everybody was saints. So that's what. But the fact is that there are two commandments are coming together here. The third commandment, which is to keep the Lord's Day holy, and the fourth commandment, honor thy father and mother. And our principal father is the Holy Mother Church, is the Pope and the Church's rules. These two commandments come together to tell us that the way to fulfill the third commandment is to keep the day holy, especially by attending the holy sacrifice of the Mass. This is a positive command. Being a positive command, the principle applies. Lex positiva non obligat in grave incommodo. That is, a positive law does not oblige in grave inconvenience. So I'm obliged to keep the day holy, but if I am dying of cancer or dying of some grave sickness and I'm not able, when you're in very grave sickness, you may not even be able to say the rosary. You may not even be able to pray, only maybe hold a crucifix, and that's all. And so if you're in a grave sickness, you're not able to even pray, then you hold on to the crucifix, but you're not obliged to do something special to keep the day holy because of the sickness. There can be physical reasons why you don't go to Mass on Sunday. the physical impossibility due to sickness, due to distance, due to some other reason that makes it truly impossible for you to get to the Mass on Sunday. Then there's the moral reasons to not go. Here we say moral reasons, we don't mean holy and unholy, but where because of circumstances, because of moral circumstances, you're not able to go. So physically it might be possible, but morally it's not possible. That is, according to circumstances, it's not possible. So some of the moral reasons why you would not go to Mass on Sunday would be that, if there is a necessity of charity, the necessity of charity. So for instance, I had a case, remember when I was a kid, that one of the men was driving to Mass on Sunday to our chapel. There was a car accident in which someone was killed, another person was gravely injured. It took a long time. There were no cell phones in those days and so on. It took a long time for the police, for the ambulances to show up and so on. And so the person got out, the man who went to Mass on Sunday, he got out of the car, he took the people out of the car, and when he finally did come to Mass, Mass was over. He came at the time of the Ite Missa Est with blood all over his suit. And so he missed the Mass. He came at the very end. But obviously there was a moral necessity. There was an act of charity to save someone's life, so he didn't make it to Mass on time. So there was no need to go to confession. There was no sin. So there could be a moral necessity because of charity. There could be a moral necessity because of justice. So according to justice, we're obliged, the soldier has to guard the fort on Sunday. The police officer has to be a cop on Sunday. The priest has to fulfill his duties on Sunday. And maybe even a priest could even miss Mass on Sunday, because maybe he is obliged to go and anoint all the soldiers in the battlefield. And even a priest can sometimes miss a Mass on Sunday. And so that there can be the obligation of justice according to our duties of state, which would prevent us from being able to go to Mass, even though physically it might be possible. And then there is a situation that applies to us. And these other situations in which you may also miss the Mass on Sunday, where it's morally impossible to go to Mass on Sunday, and that'll be when there is no Mass in union with the Pope and in union with the Holy Roman Catholic faith to attend, so that there is a physical Mass to go to. For instance, in the Eastern Church, many churches are Orthodox, and they all have valid Masses. They all have valid priests, and they celebrate the exact same rite that we celebrate in the Catholic Church. The Eastern rites, not the Western rite, but they celebrate the same rite, the same Mass, and they're valid Masses. Christ is truly present, but they are not united to the Church. So it is considered a moral impossibility to go to a Mass in which the priest and the Church, even though it has a valid Mass, even though it has a valid priest and valid ceremony, it is not united to Holy Mother Church. It can be united to Holy Mother Church by schism. It can be not united by heresy. So heresy can cut it off from the Church. Schism cuts it off from the Church. And as St. Thomas says, schism is usually very theoretical, because schism means you're only cut off by charity and there's no error. But in most schismatics are also heretics. They're not usually just schismatics. For instance, the Eastern schismatics, they're heretics because they reject the primacy of the Pope. They don't just cut themselves off from the Pope because they refuse to have communion with the Pope, because they hate the Pope, which would be a sin against charity, but they believe the Pope has no authority of jurisdiction over all the souls in the Church, including the ones in the East, including the Emperor, including the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Moscow, and so on. They don't believe he has authority, and therefore they are in error, and that's a heresy. That God made, our Lord Jesus Christ, when he founded the Church, he made the Pope the head of every single member of the Church, including bishops, including patriarchs, including emperors, and not just the regular people, nor only over the Western Church. Because remember, the Pope is not only the Pope of the whole Church, he's also the Patriarch of the Western Church. There are many patriarchs in the Church. The Pope is one of the patriarchs, but he is not just a patriarch. He is also the head of the other patriarchs. He is not equal to the other patriarchs. He is above them. And the Eastern Church doesn't, well, Eastern Catholics believe that, of course, but Eastern Orthodox, who are not Catholic, they reject that. Therefore, you cannot go to an Orthodox Mass. You can't go to an Orthodox Mass because they are in heresy. They reject the authority of the Pope. So therefore, even though there's a Mass available, there's a valid Mass, there's sacraments, you cannot go. It's a moral impossibility. Furthermore, in that case, if you do go, it will be a sin. The same can also be the case in regard to justice. Supposing you're obliged under justice to guard the Fort Knox. Fort Knox is near us in Kentucky, so you're obliged to guard the gold that isn't there. You're obliged to guard the gold inside of Fort Knox, and you're guarding the gold, and you decide, I don't want to guard the gold in Fort Knox, I got to go to Mass because it's time for Mass. You will commit a mortal sin by going to Mass, because it's your obligation to guard the gold. And by going to Mass, you would commit a mortal sin because you are doing it in violation of an obligation of justice. Then also, so with regard to the not going to Mass, now we have the situation of heresy. Now when we consider the situation of heresy or grave error in the faith, this is something which is independent of the personal state of the soul of the priest. So we assume, for instance, that all the Orthodox priests mean well, and that they perhaps believe that they're truly members of the church, or maybe they're not malicious or wicked in their heresy. But even if they're not malicious in their heresy, they're not wicked in their heresy, they are truly not under the Pope, and they reject the Pope. Therefore, we cannot go to their masses. Now, in the course of the Orthodox, they belong to a visible false church. We have the problem now with regard to the last 50 years. Now, we go through the last 50 years, we now have a problem of the moral impossibility to attend some of the masses of Catholics who are baptized, ordained priests in the Catholic Church, who are true members of the church, at least in their hearts, and truly members of the church, baptized in the Catholic Church, and ordained priests in the Catholic Church, and yet we cannot attend their masses. Because of the same reason why you shouldn't go to an Orthodox Mass or a heretical Mass. When we normally say a truly heretical Mass, it would mean like the Mass of a valid priest saying Anglican Mass. Remember, there are many priests in the Anglican Church that got themselves reordained. I've met myself many of them. They've said, I was reordained because they believe that Apostolicae Curiae was correct. And they got themselves ordained validly, and they say the Anglican Mass of Common Prayer, the Book of Common Prayer, so that when they say Mass, it's valid. And some of them, the church of the Anglican Church in Denver, Our Lady of Walsingham, the priests they will not allow a priest who was not reordained to say Mass, quote unquote Mass, in their church. They believe in the real presence. They say the Mass in English, but they say a valid Mass, but there's no doubt about the validity of their Mass, unlike the new Mass, because it actually has the correct form in it, the correct matter in it, and they believe in the real presence. If you go to that Mass, you're guilty of a most grave sin against the faith, because it's a heretical Mass. The Mass is valid because they only allow valid priests and valid bishops to say Mass in the Church of Our Lady of Walsingham. It is a mortal sin for you to attend that Mass, even though it's valid, because it's a Protestant rite. It's not a Catholic rite. The rite is the Book of Common Prayer. It's not a Catholic rite. It is a Protestant rite. And even though the priests are validly ordained and believe in the real presence and make Christ truly present, it's a sacrilegious presence. When you attend that Mass, you are approving of their public state. Now, St. Thomas points out, and the fathers tell us that Mass is a public act of worship. It's a public act of worship. So we must worship God privately. For instance, you rise out of your bed in the morning and you say the morning offering. That's a private worship. You worship God when you're saying the rosary. You worship the God in your private prayers. You worship the God when you're praying mentally. But we must also worship God publicly. The public worship is the obligation that's referred to in the third commandment. That's the primary obligation referred to in the third commandment, the public act of worship. This public act of worship is done by participating in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, and that's validly celebrated in union with the Pope, in union with the Church, and with the true faith. These are the three conditions. And if these conditions are missing, one of them is missing, then we should not attend that Mass. And so with regard to the Anglicans, it's very clear, they're a false church, and they're a heretical Mass, even if it might be valid when they have validly ordained priests. Most of the Anglican priests are invalid because as Pope Leo XIII pointed out in his encyclical Apostolicae Curiae. But some got themselves reordained and made themselves valid in the 100 years since Apostolicae Curiae, which was 1893, I believe. So in any case, now we have the problem of other masses. What about the sedevacantists? What about the indult priests, such as the priests of the Fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, the priests of the diocese who are celebrating valid masses, and they are in union with the Pope, and they're saying valid masses here in the Hartford Diocese in Connecticut and all throughout the world? Why is it that we say you should not attend their masses? The reason is because of the public expression of the faith. Now, what is the public expression of the faith? The public expression of the faith is what they stand for officially, not what they stand for personally. You cannot know what I stand for personally. I tell you that I believe in God. I tell you I believe in all the teachings of the church, but it's possible that I'm not telling the truth. How do you know? Only God knows. Only God knows what's inside the heart. Only God knows what's inside the soul. You don't know what's inside the heart and the soul. You cannot judge the heart and the soul. So therefore you have to judge what is the public stance. And that is determined by the order. For in our case, the Society of St. Pius X, the Institute of Christ the King, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the indult priests. Most of them are diocesan priests who stand for the diocese. What does a diocese stand for? What does the Institute of Christ the King stand for? What do the sedevacantist chapels, what do they stand for? What is their official position? You can't check every single priest that comes in and says the Mass. We know, for instance, in the SSPX, that there are multiple priests who are sedevacantists. They're secret sedevacantists, some less secret than others. They're a secret sedevacantists, which means they don't pray for the Pope during the Mass. But when you go to the Mass of the SSPX, and the SSPX chapel, you go to St. Lawrence Chapel here, where I used to be the pastor, it's a few miles down the road. You go to St. Lawrence Chapel, and there's a priest there who's a secret sedevacantist. What do? Well, you go to Mass. He represents the SSPX. He represents the position that the Pope is the Pope. He represents the position of the Society of St. Pius X. And if he is not saying the name of the Pope in the canon, strictly speaking, he's committing a sin of dishonesty. Even if he's committing a sin of dishonesty, because he knows what he represents. He represents the SSPX. He knows what the SSPX position is. He is not mysterious about it. He then chooses to leave out the name of the Pope in the canon, which is a wrong thing for him to do and not honest. So therefore, he commits a sin if he does that, personal sin, but you're not responsible for that sin. He represents the SSPX. So you know that he represents the SSPX position. So therefore, you don't have to check. Father, did you say the Mass of the Pope? Did you say the Pope's name in the canon? Now you got to say which Pope. Francis, Michael, Peter, Ralph, Ted, Benedict. There's a lot of options out there. Victor. There's a whole bunch of options. So which Pope? Well, the Pope is Pope Francis, the one who's in Rome right now. You can't check into every single one. Mondays I take Francis. Tuesday is Peter. Wednesday is Benedict. So I got them all covered. So one of the days has got to be right. No. What's the official position? So the official position is going to be publicized by what is publicly taught. What is publicly taught. And here we're not talking about who's in sin, who's not in sin. We're not accusing people of being in sin. We're saying that this is a case where we're in a time of great confusion of the church. But one thing we do know for sure, if you hold an error, if you profess an error, and that is publicly professed, it's going to harm souls, and it's going to harm the faith and the practice of our Catholic faithful down the last 2,000 years. By their sensus catholicus, the Catholic sense we call it, by their sensus catholicus is to stay away from heretical masses, stay away from erroneous masses, stay away from those masses which don't profess the faith. So we have the profession of the faith. What is the profession of the faith? In our case here, the problems we're dealing with, new Mass. What is the situation of the new Mass? The new Mass is a Protestant rite, just like the Anglican rite is a Protestant rite. Just like an Anglican priest can be validly ordained and celebrate the Anglican Mass and make it valid, so it's possible that a Catholic priest celebrate the new Mass and perhaps it's valid. We can only say perhaps in that case because we're not sure if it's valid due to the changes that they made to the consecration. But it might be valid. And if we can assume, therefore, that it is valid, and if we assume it's valid, it's still sacrilegious. It's a Protestant rite. You should not attend a Protestant rite. Objectively speaking, it is gravely wrong to attend a Protestant rite. The new Mass is a Protestant rite. It's not a Catholic rite. As Father Hess says, the least you can say about it is it's a schismatic rite. It's not a Catholic rite. It does not express the Catholic doctrine. It goes against the Catholic doctrine. It leads away from the Catholic doctrine. And the Missal itself has heresies contained in it, such as the one in the opening prayer of February the 22nd, the priest of the chair of St. Peter. So it has, and other heresies are probably also contained in it. Therefore, it is to be avoided. Now, so that the new Mass, one should not ever go to fulfill a Sunday obligation. Why not? It's not a Catholic rite. It expresses a faith other than the one that Christ gave us, and therefore it doesn't matter about the priest. Many, many priests who celebrate the new Mass are Orthodox. They truly believe in all the teachings of the Catholic Church. They themselves personally do. Many of the priests are doing their best to be holy. Many of the priests are trying to preach Catholic sermons. Many of the priests are trying to lead souls to God and get them to go to confession and get them to be anointed. And this is very honorable and good for those priests to do that. We say many as in 1%, not many as in many, many. Many as in very few, but a great number compared to us traditional Catholics who are good priests of the Novus Ordo, who are really trying their best. They're wearing their cassocks. They're preaching the faith, and they make some mistakes sometimes. They make some erroneous statements, even perhaps heretical statements, but they do it ignorantly and not intentionally, and they want souls to come to God. But what's the problem? They're celebrating a Protestant rite. They're trying to make it as Catholic as possible by wearing nice vestments, by using a nice chalice, by singing the Kyrie in Latin, by holding the thumb and forefinger together, by using Roman Canon number 1, which is not a Catholic canon. You are told Roman Canon number 1 is the same as the old canon. All you have to do is take the canon that's in that missal and take the canon, Roman Canon number 1, and compare the words. They ain't not the same. They are not the same. If it's not the same, guess what that means? It means it's not the same. No, we're not going to worry about a theological argument right now concerning that. It's not the same. The words are not the same, therefore it's not the same. End of problem. What's the most important words? Consecration words. They're not the same. We got a problem. They're not the same. So Roman Canon number 1 is not correct. It's not correct. It is not the same as the Mass that's of the Roman Canon, of the true Mass, of the traditional Mass. So therefore, Novus Ordo Mass should never be attended. Now what about the Latin Mass? We have Latin Masses that are approved. Now what's the problem of the Latin Mass is approved? Latin Mass is approved by the bishop and by Pope Benedict, and now by Pope Francis. They are very clearly approved sub conditione, under a condition. And without this condition, they are not approved. And the condition is the acceptance of Vatican II and the new Mass, wrapped up in one. Vatican II and the new Mass. New Mass is simply the expression and liturgy of Vatican II. So the acceptance of Vatican II and its liturgical expression, which is the new Mass. As a Catholic, when you accept Vatican II and the new Mass, you reject Vatican I and the 19 councils that came before that. You reject the gospel, which we read in the Holy Missal. You reject the teachings of the saints down the last 2,000 years. You reject the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, you cannot do that. Objectively speaking, of course, it's very grave. We can't accept that. I cannot celebrate the new Mass, the old Mass, with the acceptance of the new. I celebrate the old Mass rejecting the new. Just as our Lord St. Paul said, if an angel from heaven teaches you something different, that's something new. Something that wasn't there before, therefore something new. If it's a new Mass, it's to be rejected. If it's a new teaching, it's to be rejected. We don't have to say that it's a bad teaching. It only has to be new. Now, what are going to be the effects of this false teaching? We're going to discover after 50 years, and even less than that, after 5 years, 1 year, 2 years, that this new Mass and the new teaching is going to lead souls away from Christ. It's going to lead souls away from the gospel's teaching, the teaching of the fathers of the church, the teaching of the church down the last 2,000 years, and the moral practice of the Catholic life. Now let's look over the last 50 years. What do we see? There are about 1 billion Catholics on earth right now, approximately 1 billion, a little bit more than 1 billion. Out of these 1 billion Catholics, more than 99% of them no longer believe all the teachings of the Catholic Church. The bishops, the priests, and the faithful no longer believe these things. They no longer practice the Catholic life. For instance, many children staying with only one wife and only one husband, going to Mass every Sunday, even if it's a false Mass, believing that you must serve God first and mammon second, and that the simple teachings of the faith are gone, and the knowledge of the faith is absent. The average Catholic does not know and cannot tell you the 10 Commandments or the 7 Sacraments, including priests. So we have a big loss of faith globally because of this new Vatican II teaching and because of the new Mass. Therefore, a Catholic, in order to remain faithful, he must reject these things. Now we have a Latin Tridentine Mass, which is given on the condition of the acceptance of the new Mass, on the condition of the acceptance of Vatican II. Therefore, this Mass should also be avoided. As Archbishop Lefebvre said, they have betrayed us, they have betrayed us, they have betrayed us. The people must make up their minds. What do we see happens? Now we have 25 years of the Indult. We have 25 years of it now, since 1988, or 28 years, 29 years. Time is flying. 30 years, 1988, 2018, do the math, 30 years. We have 30 years of the Indult Mass. During these 30 years, what has happened? During the course of these 30 years, the Latin Mass has increased in number in various dioceses and some religious orders throughout the world. What about the faith? In the last 30 years, we now discover that those who go to the Latin Tridentine Mass do not necessarily believe that the Catholic Church is the true church. They used to believe that necessarily before 88. They do not believe necessarily that Vatican II is straight from hell and offensive to God. They do not necessarily reject ecumenism. They do not accept the 12 Articles of the Creed as they're handed down to us down the last 2,000 years. And this is the case of great numbers of people who with clean conscience attend the Latin Mass in the Novus Ordo setting. Therefore, we see in the practice that the Latin Mass in the Novus Ordo setting leads to a loss of faith, as is warned by Archbishop Lefebvre 30 years ago. No Catholic should attend these Masses. What about the Sedevacantists? The Sedevacantists are baptized Catholics. They're in error. They're not personal heretics, but they're in error. They're in error, and they're in error because they don't want to be bad. They want to be good. But the problem is they are rejecting the truth of the faith, which is that we need a head of our church, vicar of Christ on earth. We can't be without a vicar for 50 years. We can't be without a vicar for 60 years. And this vicar is still the representative of God, and he can be weak, and he can be sinful. He can have all kinds of weaknesses and troubles, yet the church still remains holy, and we still pray for him as the head of the Holy Church, and they're in a grave error. One should not attend Sedevacantist Masses. They are good people. They mean well, but what's the problem? They have an error regarding the Holy Roman Catholic faith. This error is expressed by them. Your personal opinions when you attend the Mass don't matter. Remember, it's a public act of worship. When you go to Mass, it's a public act, not a private act. You participate in the public act. This is the original meaning of the word communion. When St. John the Almsgiver says, never take communion with a heretic, he doesn't mean receiving Holy Communion. Although that's one of the things you do at Mass often. He means don't pray in public with them. Don't be in communion. That is in union along with. Communion means union along with. Cum unio. Cum unione. With, along with, union. To be in union along with them in the expression of the heresy equals accepting the heresy. And what happens if you continue to be in communion with them? You will become a heretic. Proof, England. Proof, 25 years of the Indult Mass. Proof, the last 50 years of the new Mass. It has changed the faith of 1 billion Catholics, not all of them, only 99%. and has changed the faith of the vast majority of those going to the Latin Mass, that they accept the Mass only because it's given permission by Pope Francis, given permission by Pope Benedict, and not because it is the Mass of all times. Therefore, they are in error with regard to matters touching the faith. It is a grave danger to souls. One should not attend. So there are many reasons why we don't attend the Mass. Some can be physical, some can be personal. Then there's another reason to not attend Mass, and this is the attending to the Mass of a sinful priest. There's a moral reason mentioned by St. Thomas Aquinas. What's the rule about attending the Mass of a sinful priest? So the priest is not a heretic. The priest is teaching the Catholic faith. The priest is in union with the church, and so on. But he is a sinful priest. The rule of St. Thomas Aquinas is if the priest is a public sinner. So in the olden times, this would come up with priests living with women, or women living with priests in the rectory, and priests having children, and so on. So that the woman would live with a priest in the rectory, so you didn't have to have a mystery. There's the priest, there's the woman, there's the rector. I even ran into a case in the Philippines where I was visiting an old priest. They were told was interested in the Latin Mass, about 90 years old. And I said, what are these pictures? That's my kids, that's my grandkids. Those were his kids and his grandkids. Another priest I went to meet in the Philippines about the Latin, he couldn't show up because he had to go to his son's graduation. So I was going to visit the priest about the Latin Mass. They left out little details like he's got a girl at home and a son's graduation. Minor details they didn't tell me. But the fact is, those aren't secret matters. There's the Catholic priest with his son's graduation. There's the woman living in the rectory, and there's no mystery about it. There are the children of the priest. One priest that I know of also in the Philippines, he had at least, that we know of, 13 children. But even the children tell me they're not sure. They know there's other ones, they're just not sure who they are. But they're aware of 13. So now the thing is, so there's a case of the priest living in sin with multiple women. That's public sin. A priest living in the state of public sin, you should not attend this Mass. Now, one of the arguments that's happening now is, because there is so much crisis in the church, another example would be priests who have been convicted of the sin of pedophilia and have been convicted of a crime or another moral crime and are thereby suspended from the practice of their order. So priests that are convicted of pedophilia or of a moral crime or suspended of the use of their order, it would be sinful to attend their Mass. So this, in fact, is actually the case. In the case since Father Abraham in England has been punished by Bishop Fillet justly for his particular crime, and he admits the guilt and so on. It's wrong said to go to his Mass. He can do many things, but he cannot be functioning publicly as a priest. So if however, someone is accused of a crime, or the crime or sin is not public. So St. Thomas says, supposing there's a priest who's immoral, but the people don't know about it, or only a few people know about it. If the priest is immoral and is not known by all the people, then you can still attend his Mass. Also, if there's a doubt as to immorality, then you can still attend his Mass. There must be a certitude of immorality. It must be public immorality. A usual case is priest living with a woman, and public immorality, certain immorality, and then you don't attend his Mass. Remember also, one reason why the church has this law is that very often priests, just like anyone else, can be very easily falsely accused. Oh, father is guilty of this, and father is guilty of that, and father is guilty of the other thing. And if father is accused of a crime, you don't avoid his Mass. You continue to go to Mass. You do not avoid the Mass. You go to the Mass until there's a proof of a public crime, and that it is pertinacious and so on. So that there is a sinful priest. Now you have some cases of priests, like St. Augustine, of course, before he became a priest, he lived in sin, but then he repented of his sin, and he was ordained priest and bishop. He had children, and he lived in sin, but he repented of it. He left behind the life of sin, and then he functioned as a priest and bishop, the holiest of the bishops of the first 400 years of the church. So, in any case, with regard to, there are cases. The first reason, there are personal physical reasons why you don't go to Mass because of your physical impossibility. There are moral reasons not to attend Mass because of moral impossibility due to virtue, practice of virtue, or it can be because of a moral impossibility to attend Mass because of the wickedness or because of the heresy or sin of faith on the part of the priest. First, the sin of faith. That's the main thing. When you get to the moral level, then you must be more careful. When you get to the moral level, you must be certain, is this a case of calumny? Is it a case of detraction? Is it a case of a real sin? But if there is a true, public, proven sin, then you avoid that priest's mass. If not, then you don't. And so, then of course, so that because it's a positive law, the third commandment, there can be many reasons to not attend the mass. There can be no reason to the exception of the first commandment. We must always believe in the faith. We must always profess the faith. And we cannot ever spit on the faith or do something that leads to a denial of the faith or make an actual denial of the faith. These things we cannot do. So there's no exceptions to the first commandment's principal obligation. There are many exceptions to the third commandment's principal obligation, which is to keep the day holy primarily by going to Mass on Sunday. So in any case, I went on a bit too long there, but just some of the rules, some of the principles about the Mass on Sunday, and why we should avoid or not avoid the Masses on Sunday. Those are God bless you all, in the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. To complete so then first of all, just need to complete the catechism here, because at the time there didn't complete the catechism of the given our crisis in the church, present situation, what are the moral implications as regard to avoiding these masses? And we must note that, that objective A and subjective A. We speak objectively and subjectively. So objectively, of course, one should never go to a mass in which there is a separation from the Pope, in which there is a error or heresy against the faith, or in which there is an acceptance of error or heresy against the faith. So we shouldn't accept that. There also shouldn't go to a mass of a publicly, clearly immoral priest, but in the other cases of private, of unknown immorality or unknown heresy, then you can go to the mass. Like for instance, if there is a case of a priest who is believed to be a sedevacantist, who might be a sedevacantist, but who says Mass in a non-sedevacantist church, if you know for sure he's sedevacantist, and perhaps it's better to avoid his Mass if you can, but you could actually be tolerated because of he doesn't represent sedevacantism in that church. So that but as regards to moral obligation, you remember that objectively one should stay away from these masses. Subjectively, however, that is regarding individuals, we're in a great crisis in the Catholic Church. And so when we consider that we're in a great crisis in the church, that we don't accuse anyone who goes to the new Mass of being a mortal sin. If you go to the new Mass, we don't say it's a mortal sin. You should not go, but we don't say it's a mortal sin. Not a mortal sin to go to the Institute of Christ the King, not a mortal sin to go to the Fraternity of St. Peter, or the Indult Mass, or the Society of St. Pius X, or the Sedevacantist, and so on. Why not a mortal sin? Because of the crisis in our church, because of the mitigating circumstances. We like to compare it to eating meat on Friday. You know that it is a sin to eat meat on Friday. It's against the law of the church to eat meat on Friday. Even the new code says you shouldn't eat meat on Friday. But it lays it out in such a way that there's exceptions, that if you go to communion, for instance, you can eat meat on Friday, and there's a confusion about the law. Given there's a confusion about the law, we can say that it's no longer a mortal sin to eat meat on Friday. It would still be a sin, but a venial sin to eat meat on Friday. It was a mortal sin to eat meat on Friday before Vatican II, and before the confusion of law and the confusion of the present situation entered. It's still known you shouldn't eat meat on Friday. We still should be confessed that you don't eat meat on Friday, and you did eat meat on Friday. We can still say it's a sin to eat meat on Friday, but it will be a venial sin, not a mortal sin, because of the circumstances in the world today. And kind of applying that same principle to the Mass situation, we say we're in a time of confusion. It is dangerous for your faith and will lead souls away from God, as we see by the 1 billion examples in the new church and by the many examples in the indult communities. And now what's happening in the Society of St. Pius X, that souls wander more and more away from the position of Archbishop Lefebvre and more away from the truth. It is very dangerous for the soul. You should not go there. But we don't say it's a mortal sin. It's not a mortal sin to go. Not a mortal sin because of the mitigating circumstances. The mitigating circumstances of our crisis in the church. And that it is a time of confusion. We also say that even though objectively it's not confusing, objectively the situation is clear. It's a subjective confusion. Like, say, for instance, in this room, the chairs are in one place, the walls in another place, the windows in another place, and there's no confusion. But if you fill the room with smoke, or you cloud the eyes, I can have a confusion, because even though it's very clear where the door is, where the walls are, where the windows are, because of the smoke and because of the darkness in my eyes, I can be confused, even though there's no objective confusion. So in a similar way, in the church today, there is an objective confusion. The laws of the church remain the same. The laws of faith remain the same. But there is subjective confusion. There is smoke of Satan enter the Vatican, like Paul VI said a few years ago. The smoke of Satan has entered the Vatican. The smoke of Satan has entered the church. And one of the effects of the smoke of Satan entering the church is it causes us to not see as clearly things that we should see clearly. Hence, we do not accuse anyone of being in sin. And also, remember that in the past, you could safely say, Father said don't do that, therefore I'm not going to do that. And that would be a safe thing to do. But in our age, you ask 10 fathers the same question, you're going to get 10 different answers. So you can no longer say, Father said to do that is sufficient. So that the Father said is no longer sufficient either. You have to know your faith, know your catechism, and also respond to grace. We also have to remember that to see the truth and to follow the truth is a grace of God. It's a gift from God. And we also don't apply to others what they apply to us. Like one thing I forgot to mention, the practical case, a good simple example, that Father Ortiz, remember a couple years ago, he's talked about the Bishop Ambrose coming and visiting Kentucky and saying the Latin Mass there, the Tridentine Mass, the Catholic priest. But because he did that, he says that somehow we're guilty of schism, and it's a mortal sin for you to go to my Mass. So do I stand up here? So Father Ortiz said it's a mortal sin to go to Father Pfeiffer's Mass. It's a mortal sin to go to Father Hugo's Mass. That you be guilty of the danger of being somehow in schism because this guy had a guy who was maybe in schism, who wasn't in schism, who met another guy who was in schism, who had a dog that was related to somebody who was in schism, and therefore you're in danger of being in schism because you're schismatized because you met a guy who knew a guy, another guy who was somewhere related to some guy who was just terrible. Well, it's a mortal sin. So now, if he's going to say foolish things like that, he can see a counselor, he can change his medication, there's many things he can do to fix that problem, but it is not for us then to return the favor by saying, you can't go to Father Ortiz's Mass. Father Ortiz, as far as I know, teaches that the Pope is the Pope. He prays for the Pope in the Mass. He teaches the Catholic faith. He's against the modernism going on in the Society of St. Pius X. Father Ringwald also is against these things. They tell you don't go to our Mass. Okay, I don't agree with their judgment. They shouldn't say that, but that's their own personal judgment. They think it's a mortal sin to go to my Mass. They don't have a good reason for it, but they'll have to answer that before God, and they'll have to answer that in their own consciences. But I don't tell you if you're going to Washington, D.C., you're going to Vienna, Virginia, and you can attend Father Ringrose's Mass. He says the true Mass. He has the true faith. He teaches the correct doctrine, so far as I know. He accepts the Pope as the head of the church. He rejects the modernism going on in the Society of St. Pius X. He just hates Father Pfeiffer. You have good judgment. It's probably a good thing to do. So there's no problem with hating Father Pfeiffer. It's a moral problem between him and God, perhaps, but it's not a problem to hate Father Pfeiffer. It's not a problem to say, that they shouldn't say, don't go to Father Pfeiffer's Mass, don't go to Father Hugo's Mass, don't go to the priests who are connected with us as Mass. But that's up to them. The rule of the church is there something objectively wrong in what they're doing that's offensive to God, and therefore you shouldn't go to their Mass? The answer is no. If they have personal opinion, think should go to our Mass, okay, that's their problem. So we follow the laws of the church. There's a reason why we follow the laws of the church, a reason why we follow canon law, a reason why we follow the divine moral law, because it makes for stability, it makes for sanity, it makes for the law of charity to be followed in the world. We're in a time of crisis, so therefore we cannot say it's a sin to go to any of these Masses. But you shouldn't go. It's a danger to your faith if you do go. We highly recommend you do not go, and you should not go because of the danger to the faith. And in order to preserve your faith, and we have 2,000 years of history to back us up. We have the whole of England that lost the faith because they made that compromise. We have many souls in communism that lost the faith because of that compromise. So many Orthodox have left the faith because of that compromise. They weren't originally Orthodox, but they became Orthodox over a period of years and years. So likewise, we should avoid these things. And we should avoid the Masses, but no accusation of sin. No accusation of sin. We're in a time of great crisis in the church, And it takes grace to see the truth. It takes grace to do the right thing. And we ask for God to give that grace to those souls that want it, and to those, and that grace will be given, and to preserve those that are making mistakes. Those that are making mistakes, we pray that they are preserved from the loss of faith, preserved from the damage being done by the grave mistake they're making. But as a shepherd, as a representative of our Holy Mother, the Church, I'm obliged to tell you, stay away from such things. In any case, regarding the moral obligations, there's sufficient there. And so just to conclude, and so keep the faith, practice the faith, and remember the rules of the Church in regard to the commandments. Positive laws have exceptions, and these are positive laws. They have exceptions, and we judge leniently the persons, and we judge harshly the ideas. We'll close, and God bless you all. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Now we can sing the recessional.